I want to thank Maria and her associates for inviting me to join you today, which it's a genuine pleasure to be able to do, because I'm not coming here to perform academic expertise, and I'm not coming here in the name of a kind of refined body of knowledge, but really in the name of a field of convergences, which is how I see my practice and how I perceive from a distance the practice of Bach. And the convergences that are between knowledges that emanate from different places, knowledges that emanate from artistic practices, that emanate from intellectual work, that emanate from policy making, that emanate from social organization and modes of activism, all of which converge into kind of an emergent field, which I'm trying to think of as participation or taking part. I should say, after the presentations by both Maria and in the name of the Dutch Art Critics Association, that I'm actually not coming in the name of poverty. Although, not to be outdone, the institution I work in is equally poor. But I think I actually come in the name of a huge wealth, because participation is about us, and about the sort of ever-increasing perceptions that we have of how to kind of mobilize ourselves within this kind of field of convergences. So the subject I wish to discuss is participation. The question of how to take part in culture, beyond the roles and rituals that culture has allotted us. Roles such as voters, census form fillers, jury members, demonstrators, or in the world of contemporary art in which I'm involved, roles such as viewers, listeners, visitors, the different stratas that make up the notion of audience. Now, speaking from this particular moment, from right now, I would characterize our situation as one in which a wide range of participatory models have been proposed by different practices: NGOs, multitude politics, self-organization, modes of activism, free universities and academies, self-education, think tanks, both highly instrumentalized for the tasks of mobilizing knowledge for governance, and self-generated one, community organizing, etc. And I'm thinking of sort of work across the field, such as Bruno Latour's really magnificent project at ZKM, Making Things Public, and Michel Ferrer's very recent book that has just come out on non-governmental politics, that is beginning to kind of make us understand that what we're speaking of is not something marginal that kind of emerges at the edge of things and at moments of emergency. That what we're sort of seeing around us within what we could maybe loosely call NGO culture, into which I would kind of bring the art world, is really another mode by which we combine self-organization and emergent modes of governance. And I think that is a huge part of this participatory term that I'm sort of trying to think about. In the contemporary art world, of which I am part for over 30 years, many artists have been proposing modes of making the spaces they inhabit spaces of participation, and of moving us from being a passive to being an active mode of audience. What are the ever more complex ways by which we have shifted from being kind of passive contemplators to being critically conscious, to being critically active, to completing the work, and to where I see us today, which is actually to becoming the work. Now, I wanted, because what gets generated from this institution, what kind of meets up with us in this field of convergence, which I think contemporary knowledge is, really comes through the kind of drives and energies of practice. I wanted to maybe start with a kind of series of moments from the 1960s and 1970s, which I think that mark the sort of process by which we became an audience. That we moved from being a series of kind of passive contemplators, edified by this or that grand vision, to actually becoming an audience. So I think in the sort of period between, let's say, the 1960s and 1980s, much work was made to disentangle seemingly natural and interlinked relations between the four constitutive elements that make up sort of our arena: art, artist, institution, and audience. Now, initially, much of this work took the form of institutional critique, a model that I think we have kind of managed to move beyond, but nevertheless is kind of a central building block of where we've managed to get to. So much of this work has taken the form of institutional critique, with work by the likes of Hans Hake, analytical work about seemingly contemplative spaces. I'm thinking of work like the MoMA Poll of 1970, which brought Nixon's Indochina policies into MoMA by asking the audience to vote, to cast a vote, and to say, in answer to the question, would the fact that Governor Rockefeller had not denounced President Nixon's Indochina policies be a reason for you not to vote? And the sort of moment in which, as I'm sure you all know, Rockefeller money is totally central to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Rockefellers have dominated the board of governors of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So to bring the Rockefellers into MoMA, you know, at a completely different register, and via that to bring in a kind of possibility of an audience taking part and having some kind of say with regard to Nixon's Indochina policies, was a kind of moment in which the divisions that we had seen between art, artist, institution, and audience, and of course kind of what we might call the general culture, get broken down. And followed after that by gallery visitor profiles, asking your opinion about profit-oriented business, integrated schools, presidential candidates, civil liberties, etc. A famous project that managed to get Hake's exhibition at the Whitney closed down was the project called Power Relations, about Manhattan real estate values, that led in kind of direct lines to boards of governors of mainstream New York museums, and began the entire question, which had never been asked, about the real estate interests of these institutions. You know, who sat on massively expensive kind of ground, and as we know, subsequently have kind of continued to develop upwards using their airspace as ever more exclusive real estate, and so on and so on. Then projects that investigated installation values, the work that we also at Documenta of Ronald Reagan behind a velvet robe, faced with a photo of anti-nuclear demonstrators in Germany, which again began to kind of unravel the language of display and make links between the kind of distantiations that the environments of contemporary art produced in direct contrast to the kind of promise that they put forward. And finally, huge body of work concerning sponsorship, where companies like Alcan, a major aluminum producer in the United States, and a major sponsor of various cultural activities, and a major polluter of numerous rivers, were brought in a kind of critical investigation. So there's sort of layers, really, of interests, of managerial and other interests that somebody like Hawkins was able to peel away and expose certain kinds of power relations beneath. And then I was thinking of someone like Marcel Brutter's Museum of Modern Art Department of EGLE's financial section, which was constantly claiming for itself that it was not an artwork. This is not an artwork, this work stated. Instead of which, kind of producing for us an organizational and bureaucratic logic that could be applied to any conglomeration of objects and images. And speaking about the way in which the spaces of art were always spaces that were somehow claiming positions of universal knowledge, and how we become inscribed within positions of universal knowledge. And then I thought of the work of Daniel Sperry, who's somebody who's very close to my heart. And his wonderful sort of series of Musée Sentimental that he positioned in various exhibitions throughout the 1980s, in which I think after the sort of sheer analytical rage of what was happening within institutional critique, the kind of vehement rage that we were sort of seeing as things were kind of exposed and laid bare and so on. One of the things that was hugely welcome in Sperry's Musée Sentimental was the way in which he mobilized the notion of affection. That he understood that part of the way in which we are inscribed, in which we are constituted as an audience, is through the sort of strategies of affection. So the work of affection in the space of the museum, and I was thinking, I actually only ever saw one of these things in a huge exhibition in Berlin when I was a student called Prussians in Search of a History, that kind of went over the entire city of West Berlin, into which Sperry introduced several kind of armoires, sort of vitrines, full of the ugliest china you had ever seen. The kind of china that your grandmother had, with flowers and sort of things. And somehow made a connection between a sentimental affection that one might have to extremely ugly objects of one's past. The sort of aesthetic legacy of the Prussian monarchy, known for its exceptional bad taste, and the sort of notions of bourgeois enjoyment, of the way in which bourgeois enjoyment is actually a sort of active and dynamic part of this process of inhabiting the museum. And then sort of finally in this kind of brief landscape, I was thinking of the way in which out of the museum display spaces and spaces of governance had kind of begun to conflate, and I was thinking particularly of Hans Hacker's work again in the Reichstag in Berlin, and the kind of insistence that he was making from shifting to a building that was devoted to dem deutsche Volk, to a notion of das Bevölkerung, to a notion of the people, and of the way in which the kind of the instantiation, the performance of that kind of shift within these spaces, and the understanding that the sort of what is shared is the ability of the public to move through a space And that is why within these kind of spaces that don't share functions but share possibilities, it is enormously important to kind of produce and manifest. So all of these were relatively didactic strategies. They exposed, they analyzed, they fantasized, they ridiculed. They had a very strong sense of right and wrong. The wrong could be moral, political, aesthetic, it could be bourgeois indulgence, it could be patriarchy. And the reason that I think of them as a kind of prior trajectory, a trajectory that maybe opened up this notion of our having become an audience, is because I think that they follow a kind of a movement from what I would call from critique to criticality. Now, I think in critique, which in sort of the field of intellectual work is largely associated with the project of late structuralism, post-structuralism, critique is deployed in order to question the assumptions which allow certain claims to circulate in the world as truth claims, that build on knowledges in order to produce claims for the truth. And I think that this is to a very large extent what kind of allowed critique, the kind of moral indignation that we experience in so much of this early work. I think the shift that we have undergone is the shift towards criticality. And criticality, I think, is somewhat different. Obviously, it builds on critique. But it defines a state in which we are simultaneously immensely informed, theoretically able to see through, to analyze, to expose, to unveil, to understand power relations, to understand protocols and formats and so on. At the very same time as understanding that while doing that, we're also living out the very conditions of which we speak. So what we're inhabiting at the moment is a situation in which we have to produce a language that is never standing outside of things, that is never critically kind of distantiated and able to kind of speak with moral indignation about that. Because we know that we are inscribed in the very thing that is that. We know that we're living out its conditions. The possibility of allocating blames and taking moral high grounds becomes extremely difficult. And we need other languages. And I think that it's in this realm, in the realm of criticality, that my series of questions are located. Now, Buck being sort of the mouse that roared, I think this is a wildly overambitious project, and I like it for that, and I know that I can't achieve it, but I think that wildly overambitious projects, though doomed to failure, are sort of necessary kind of gesture. And obviously, beyond the active-passive division of that old model of taking part in culture, which cannot be sustained in the wake of the immense rethinking of spectatorship and positionality that has taken place in the last 25 years of theoretical analysis. And further to ask, can the spaces of art be thought as the spaces of appearance designated by Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition, in which Arendt characterized as speech and action, loosely coming together for a momentary expression and then coming apart again. This space of appearance articulated by Arendt is neither concretely inhabited, nor is it temporally constant. It comes into being, I'm quoting Arendt now, whenever men are together in the manner of speech and action, and therefore it precedes and predates all formal constitution of the public realm and its various forms of government. Now, this project had its genesis 10 years ago, on a visit that I made to an exhibition that I was working in the United States at that time. And this was an exhibition that was to take place at the Whitney Museum of American Art, and one that we had all been looking forward to. It was called Black Male. It was curated by Thelma Golden, and with a kind of generating group of really the pantheon of important African American thinkers. It was the first such exhibition to take place in a mainstream museum in New York, and so it was something that we were really looking forward to. And I flew from California to New York to see the exhibition, went on a Sunday afternoon, and within 10 minutes I was bored out of my mind. And this was dreadful, because, you know, the level of expectations and investment and so on. And the reason I was so bored was that it was an entirely encyclopedic exercise. There were about 600 of every images that had ever been sculpted, painted, digitalized, photographed, media serialized in one way or another of African American masculinities. And as we know, encyclopedic exercises, which are the kind of accretion of information, rarely do anything. And so for all of its kind of immense promise, it ended up being a rather quiet and not very active exhibition. But I had gone from California, so I had to in some way rescue, salvage the moment. So I started looking around, and within a second I realized that what was happening in the audience was enormously interesting. Because one normally did not see large numbers of African American men in mainstream American museums. And here almost the entire audience in that afternoon was African American men, so that was one surprise. The second one was that they were the best dressed audience I had ever seen in my life. And they were dressed in a kind of multitude of ways, from canty cloth and kind of African nationalist garb to black leather sports gear, you know, Armani suits, transvestites, a lot. Each outfit was perfectly conceptualized and executed and performed. And that was pretty interesting. And the third was that it was a very didactic, very text-heavy exhibition, and this superbly dressed audience was performing reading the texts. There's no other way to put it. They were attentive to the text at a level that was kind of unthinkable in any other situation. And this is where Arendt's notion of spaces of appearance comes up. Because it was very clear that it was not the case that 600 men of different stratas of New York society had called each other up that morning and said, hey, let's go to the Whitney and perform, whatever. It was clear that what had happened to them was basically what had happened to me, and which, sort of drawn by the promise of something, what they found was a structure of representation. And what then ensued was they took over the exhibition, they became the exhibition. And so the sort of they were functioning as a space of appearance. And which, you know, in Agamben's terms was a means without end. It was a series of gestural codes which did not then go into producing an alternative kind of model of governance. And shortly afterwards, I was invited to some shindigs, Scandinavian shindig in the Arctic Circle, and was mostly for curators, and I decided to do something with this. And I wrote a text called How to Dress for an Exhibition. And to my immense surprise, the curators at this gathering kind of really engaged with it. And they really engaged with it because they sort of didn't see this, the privileging of audience over their activities, as a kind of insult or a disempowerment. They saw it as an immense field of possibility, that they would be generative in producing some kind of a platform which people could then take over, enact, perform, and sort of move along, away from the structures of representation. So this is kind of the genesis of this project. Now, Deleuze says, in Difference in Repetition, that to participate is to lay a claim to a ground. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Lay a ground to a claim. Sorry. Other people to misquote. And I would say that my entire participation project is in this spirit of laying a ground to a claim, rather than to elaborate a set of strategies by which one intervenes. So I think that one of the shifts that I'm sort of talking about is this shift from the kind of consciousness raising that I was talking about in relation to, let's say, AICA Bruters, Barbara Bloom, there's very different artists, Louise Lola, from that kind of consciousness raising to a notion of active intervention, which is oppositional and critical, to what Deleuze calls laying the ground for a claim. And laying the ground for a claim is, I think, completely different from critiquing, exposing, or analyzing, because it is active, it is generative, and it is performative. And those are the sort of qualities that are immensely important to me, and that's why I say, in this case, I don't feel like I'm in the name of poverty, because I think there is such a vast amount to activate. That is a resource that we don't know how to think of as resource. Now, we're aware, and maybe to sort of lay out the question that I think has been driving this phase of the project, and that's the sort of question that in thinking of laying a ground to a claim, we need to engage notions of whether this is an individual or a collective enterprise. One of the things that's kind of been complicated about thinking participation, about thinking audience, is the degree to which audience has always been privatized and individualized. And one of the things I want to think about is the kind of collectivities that come into play in audience. But not the kind of collectivities that demographics sort of point to. Not the kind of collectivities that tell you, how many men, how many women, how many people of color, how many working class, Not that notion of collectivity, but this notion of Hannah Arendt's, this notion of space of appearance, when men come into play in speech and action for the duration of a moment and then come apart again. Now, in the name of collectivity, of emergent collectivities, of new formation of collectivity, we're very well aware that there is a proliferation of activisms at present. We understand their issues, we understand the relations between the groups and movements, but do we fully understand how this proliferation has changed our notion of access to the political? It is here, in the reflection on access, that activism and participation become a complex continuum of modes, providing a relation to access. Access to institutions, access to world events, access to one another. And I think that in the art world, and in the kind of art worlds that most of us here are active in, this is an absolutely crucial question, because in the publicly subsidized world, we are constantly under the aegis to produce accessibility, to produce easy points of entry into culture, to produce, what the kind of the institute that sits most dominantly on our horizon in London, Tate Modern, produces what our students call critique light. It's a kind of consumable kind of notions of illustrated critique. And the sort of and I'm going to digress for a moment because this is, for me, an important point. Just hope I'm not going to overrun my time. Which is that there is a tacit understanding that the modes of parliamentary representative democracy need to be reproduced throughout the institutions of culture, and that reproduction of parliamentary representative democracy then demands notions of representation and notions of accessibility. And I would want to argue that it is absolutely essential for us to move away from being modes of representation and modes of accessibility, and to start thinking of what it is to produce access. Because the enormous difference between accessibility and access is that the one is produced for you, and the other you produce for yourself. And the sort of notion of what you are entering, what you're gaining access to, is not at all clear, because that gets produced in the process. And I've been sort of trying to. One of the interesting things about this project has been that it became very clear that the language that I inherited, art and audience and institution and museum and so on, was really not very useful, and that I need other language. And so I've been trying to kind of articulate for myself a little vocabulary that would carry this. And access seems very, very important to me. And so I've been trying to read around and think about what might kind of clarify. And then I read a description that Deleuze wrote about, Deleuze, who loved Foucault and loved Foucault's thinking, wrote some wonderful things about Foucault. And one of the things that he wrote, he said, Foucault was a war machine. He was always bristling with rage and anger and militance and so on. And he described standing next to him at various demonstrations in Paris during the 60s or 70s. And he said he would be shaking, violently shaking with anger. And I thought of my own first kind of initial readings of Foucault, and of the absolutely astonishing kind of recognitions that those initial readings brought. That kind of moment in which one realized that maybe things didn't have to be as they are. You know, and the thing that Deleuze talks about all the time in relation to Foucault, he says Foucault is a man of passion. Foucault produces passion. And I started thinking that passion is access. That passion is what kind of breaks through these incredibly kind of tight and arid protocols of accessibility into that kind of moment in which something can be envisaged as different, as not that which one has inherited. And that the sort of Deleuze's ability to see that huge transformative leap and to call it passion, because to understand that it's not just intellectual work, it's a drive. And it's a drive that necessarily has to, in some way, make absolutely productive use of that rage that he describes so well, that kind of shaking, bristling rage that he calls Foucault's war machine. Now, one of the issues that shift to access necessitates is for us to ask, what is urgency? And that's a term that Maria has already mentioned. And how does it differ from emergency? To an understanding that emergency is always a response to a set of immediate circumstances, and therefore leads to protocols and structures of representation, while urgency is a recognition of the systemic shift in relations between the constitutive elements of the world that we live in. So for me, at the heart of all of this is an attempt to look away. And this book that I've been writing on participation, it's called Looking Away. It's an attempt to look away from the centers of power as defining both the questions that are being asked and the ways in which we might have to respond to these. Instead, we want to focus our attention on the proliferation of activist and participatory manifestations around the globe. It's becoming clear that these are marking the desire of people to actually articulate their own questions and find ever more inventive modes of taking part in the processes that are determining their lives. Equally, that they're doing so in minor gestures rather than in major gestures that don't pretend at wholesale change, but manifest an engagement and an involvement through a series of minute transformations. Equally, we've become interested in the exceptionally manifest and performative quality of this new sensibility. The sheer numbers of people marching, demonstrating, writing statements, making their way to the World Social Forum, banding together on the internet, communicating ferociously, figuring out alternative ways of educating themselves for contemporary needs that are unfathomed by institutions. The new uses of cultural spaces such as art institutions, rock festivals, and international exhibitions as communicative forums. All these have clearly moved these activities away from the traditional model of ideological protest and towards an understanding that there are possibilities for insisting that one is in the world and one is heard, without rushing to establish new institutional structures that will replace the old ones. And I would say that there are kind of a couple of things that have been really very interesting about the sort of the art world and the world of intellectual work that I think are kind of affinities. For me, maybe the most interesting thing that's happened in the art world in the last decade, and definitely kind of cued by Documenta 10 and Documenta 11, has been that the art world became a kind of meeting ground and a conversation site for convergences that have never taken place before. So scientists and artists, theorists and critics, architects and planners, policymakers, activists, kind of again and again found possibilities to meet, talk to one another within the art world. And this was not a conversation that was taking place anywhere else. So the notion that the art world is not necessarily generating those knowledges, but hosting those knowledges, enabling convergences, became incredibly interesting. And as I think in common with many people who are thinking exhibitions and thinking public spaces, the notion of a gathering. That a gathering is a kind of generative space. It's not bringing together a series of closed knowledges, but it's generating a whole set of new knowledges and new insights. In the intellectual world, one of the things that have become really interesting to me is that we've been setting up programs and sort of events whose primary aim is not the sort of to teach somebody something. The primary aim is not to kind of have a body of knowledge that we agree on and then impart it to a group of sort of willing people, but to raise a term or a concept and to sit back and to see who comes. And that in the sort of way in which people begin to kind of see themselves reflected in something, new knowledge begins to come about. So the kind of shift, which I think has taken place both within the expanded field of art and the expanded field of intellectual work, as I think you can see, I don't think intellectual work takes place in universities, certainly not in universities alone. The understanding that we only know, this terrible sentence, it's like a tongue twister, but basically we know what we know how to know. And the question is, how to know what we don't know how to know. And the strategies that have come about, both in the expanded field of art practice and in the expanded field of intellectual work, which has been to kind of raise a flag and see what happens. Put an enormous amount of work into kind of articulating that flag, but not produce a subject for it. Have been, I think, hugely heartening developments. That have allowed precisely what I'm thinking of as participation. That by sort of converging, by coming towards something, one is participating through the production of knowledge, rather than agreeing with, or learning and so on, existing knowledge. So this means that, in a way, one of the things that has happened is that we begin to privilege the drive to enter the fray, rather than the clear expression of some belief. and understand that that drive is what is propelling things along. One of the interesting things that have taken place is that NGOs could be seen as a symptom of mobility, of this drive, of the ability to contingently and speedily move into situations of crisis or the breakdown of an infrastructure. So dealing with a particular set of requirements on the ground without seeking to institutionalize these solutions. They're also bound up in a network of relations with one another while having an oblique relation to both states and multinationals. So as such, NGOs exemplify a new understanding of culture and politics of singularity. This means that while each entity follows an internal logic of its own, a new collective relationality has emerged between them, not one based on shared ideologies, but on contingent imperatives, on principles of mobility and communication, as I mentioned above. Within the world of contemporary arts, one hears people constantly referring to themselves as NGOs. By this, they do not mean that they're providing essential help at a time of crisis. Or maybe they do mean just that. Perhaps with the ability to band together temporarily around an urgent question, to arrive at an alternative funding and operating structure, to access public resources and attention in an alternative way. Perhaps these are as important as the provision of urgent resources. And perhaps the use of this terminology, this language of the NGO, is an attempt to locate our situation as equally in crisis, but in need of contingent measures. In a correspondence between Negri and Deleuze, I found the following sentence. Negri says, "The subject is the boundary of a continuous movement between an inside and an outside. If the subject cannot be reduced to an externalized citizenship, can it invest citizenship with force and life?" And I thought that there's probably no better articulation to the kind of process of participation that I am after than this notion of an investment of citizenship with force and life rather than its reduction to a kind of externalized operative mode. So I would like to think this in relation to these spaces, these places, these practices of contemporary art, thereby acknowledging that these are not isolated, specialized, particularized sites devoted to escaping the world and its woes through aesthetic contemplation and edification, but rather sites of alternative engagements, which we do not yet know how to read or how to galvanize. And I'm much more interested in learning how to read them than I am in learning how to galvanize them. The diverting of tension from that which is meant to compel it, i.e. the actual work on display, can at times free up a recognition that other manifestations are taking place that are often difficult to read, and that they may be as important as the designated objects. Recently, an exhibition opened at the Courtauld Institute of Art, which is London University's Institute of Art History. An exhibition of contemporary art selected and hung in the actual spaces of the Institute by the postgraduate students. The opening was jam-packed with the young men and women of the art world, pushing and shoving on the narrow stairs, sloshing beer over everyone, and grinding cigarettes in the hallowed 18th century staircase. This invasion of a stiff and formal traditional academic space by the floating population of art world openings was surprising enough to someone like myself who had studied at the Institute at an earlier phase. Instead of being hung in the more conventional spaces of the adjacent Courtauld galleries, the works here were distributed among the offices and seminar rooms of the Institute itself, and the viewers were asked to explore the spaces that are usually occupied by the business of teaching and of academic work, spaces cordoned off by the work being done in them and barred from the view of the general public. Even more surprising than this invited invasion was the comment I heard again and again as I trudged up and down the stairs. Well, said various visitors that evening, it's not so posh. I expected it to be a lot more posh, didn't you? What's all the fuss about this place, said another. It's just an old building, isn't it? Ending his statement on that slightly puzzled, questioning tone, as if wondering if there was some level of the experience that had been hidden to him. I, who as a student had for years been intimidated by this place and its snobberies and exclusivities, was endlessly amused. It was as if the Queen had opened her bedrooms to the public and everyone had come around to sharing the exposure of something that had been hidden so far. But beyond the voyeurism and beyond my own amusement, at a more interesting level, a form of participation was taking place in which some facade of privilege, of class and of cultural exclusion, of supposedly rarefied learning, had been breached, and the viewers were trying to figure out what exactly had kept them outside, had kept them at bay, since after all, it wasn't all that posh, was it? The exhibition on display itself probably had in mind some notion of democratization, some notion of accessibility, through undoing the boundaries of elevated separation and inserting itself in the realm of the contemporary. Its final effects, however, were almost the opposite. Rather than making people feel comfortable within its spaces, it produced, in my reading at least, an embodied manifestation of the mythical and phantasmatic which had kept them at a distance in the first place. It did so not through curatorial intention, but through a proliferation of performative acts generated by the audience, and of course by our ever-growing ability to read these performative acts. There is a popular assumption that the performance of exclusion is an actual form of remaining outside, of not daring to enter spaces perceived as exclusive or intimidating or barred. Perhaps, though, the performance of exclusion is the process of realization that exclusion has nothing to do with entrance or accessibility, and far more to do with perceptions of the possible. In the tortuous operations of trying to produce a fit between specific identities and their legible representations, the joyous possibilities of Giorgio Agamben's whatever are lost to us. The whatever in question, says Agamben, here relates to singularity, not in its indifference with respect to a common property, to a concept, for example, he says, being red, being French, being Muslim, but only in its being such as it is. In experience of the actual space, in being positioned as an actual audience, the crowd at the Courtauld Institute exited the work of framed identities in relation to which they are positioned, and judged themselves, and moved into the performative workings of the whatever. Thus, it is experiential, but not in the sense of stressing having an actual embodied experience in the space, but rather in the sense that entering a space inscribed with so many caveats and qualifications and prohibitions, in a state of what I might call unbelonging, leaves, which is kind of not belonging, but actively unbelonging oneself, leads to the active production of questions concerning the very rights of entry and belongings. It is in this sense that I would perceive of it as an embodied manifestation of the mythical and phantasmatic which had kept them at a distance in the first place. It is in this moment, in the preliminary production of these questions, that I would want to recognize the shift from entering to taking part, from following the rules allotted to us to engaging in the performative and becoming the subject of the work. Now, this, of course, sort of begins, and I think I'm going to conclude with this. This kind of begins to ask the question that I posed to myself at the very beginning, which was this notion of participation that I want to kind of think about. Is it an individual or is it a collective activity? And increasingly, the sort of formats which I've been able to kind of, some of which I mentioned from activism and so on, that I've been able to kind of see around me has, by necessity, led me to think of it as a collective enterprise. That participation is, to a very large extent, the production of new collectivities. And in this language that I'm very tentatively trying to develop for myself, I've been calling them ontological communities, communities of just being, communities that are not representative, you know, of their ethnicity or their class or their profession or their ideological beliefs or what a government says, being red, being French, being Muslim. Not those, but ontological communities of just being. Now, in this, I've been so collectivity is something that takes place as we arbitrarily gather to take part in different forms of cultural activity, such as looking at art. If we countenance that beyond all the roles that are allotted to us in culture, you know, viewers, listeners, audience members, etc., there are other emergent possibilities for the exchange of shared perspectives or insights or subjectivities. We allow for some form of emergent collectivity. Furthermore, that performative collectivity that I'm talking about, one that is produced in the very act of being together in the same space and compelled by similar edicts, might just alert us to a form of mutuality which cannot be recognized in the normative modes of shared beliefs, interests, or kinship. And I feel very strongly that to speak of collectivities is to de-nativize community. And I'm sort of very interested in the shift because community is given according to an identity. And what I'm talking about is a collectivity that comes about in the moment in which we gather together in an unintentional way and share something like looking at art without producing it as a kind of formalized kind of notion of sharing. And that at those moments we become ontological communities. In the same way that I think the well-dressed men in black male were an ontological community. They were unplanned, they were unspecified, they were singularity. And they disappeared as a collectivity as soon as they left the museum. Now, in this, I'm following in the footsteps of very, very important work of Jean-Luc Nancy's, the French philosopher, and that of Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, and work in which they insist that there is no meaning if meaning is not shared. And not because there would be an ultimate or first signification that all beings have in common, but because meaning is itself the sharing of being. So one of the things that have really interested me is, are the spaces of art, as one instance, this kind of manifestation of ontological communities, are these spaces claimable? Can we claim them to meaning as the sharing of being, not meaning as the exchange of things that we all agree on, that are familiar to us, that around which we can produce a consensus. In Nancy's assertion that everything then passes between us, do we not also have the conditions of the exhibition? And in these conditions, do we not have the possibility to shift the gaze away from artworks that might critically alert us to certain untenable states of the world, away from exhibitions that make those states of hegemonic breach and unease the subject of their activity and focal point, and towards everything that passes between us in the process of those confrontations? Therefore, do we not necessarily undergo the experience of being informed, of being cautioned, of being forced to look at that which we might so comfortably avert our gaze from, but perhaps we recognize how deeply embedded we are in the problematic, of how mutual our disturbance and fear that we, in Nancy's words, share this turmoil, as the very production of its meaning. I'm not arguing for the centrality of art exhibitions as a political space on the basis of what it exhibits, of the kind of work that the objects on display might do in the world, of the kind of issues that thematic exhibitions might alert us to. I'm arguing instead for the art exhibition as what Nancy has termed the spectacle of society, in which he says, and I'm quoting from Nancy, if being with is the sharing of a simultaneous space-time, then it involves a presentation of this space-time as such. In order to say we, one must present the here and now of this we. And one of the things I would claim is that the space of exhibitions, the space of display, is the here and now of that we. On this stage, as part of this spectacle, we can begin to perceive the possibilities for some form of action that is not planned demonstrations of political activism with their binaries of the blamed and the blaming. This stage functions as the space of appearance, Hannah Arendt invoked, in attempting to enlarge the understanding of how and where political action takes place. The peculiarity of this space of appearance, says Arendt, is that unlike the spaces which are the work of our hands, it does not survive the actuality of the movement which brought it into being, but disappears not only with the dispersal of men, but with the disappearance or arrest of the activities themselves. Wherever people gather together, it is potentially there, but only potentially, not necessarily and not forever. In partial, only very partial, reply, I might say that it is because Arendt's thought links speech and action to the very constitution of power, not power as a mode of representation, not power as the concrete articulation of ideological beliefs and their consequent translations into various structures of speech and of government. When she says what keeps people together after the fleeting moment of actions has passed, and what at the same time they keep alive through remaining together, is power. Neither force, strength, nor violence, nor the apparatuses of the state or the law. This power, conceptualized by Arendt, is the fleeting coming together in momentary gestures of speech and action by communities whose only mutuality lies in their ability to both stage these actions and to read them for what they are. The space of appearance in which these momentary actions take place are the staging grounds of protests, refusals, affirmations, and celebrations. And they do not bear the markings of traditional political spaces, but rather galvanize the spaces of everyday life and temporarily transform them by throwing flitting mantles of power over them. The reason I would wish to think of art in relation to such a space of appearance is recognition that when something called art becomes an open, interconnected field, then the potential to engage with it as a form of cultural participation rather than as a form of pleasurable edification, of representation or of contemplation comes into being. The engagement with art can provide a similar space of appearance to that described by Arendt, not by following the required set of interpolated, pensive gestures, but rather by seeking out, staging, and perceiving an alternative set of responses. What is it that we do when we look away from art by producing such a space of appearance, by attending to the circulation of meaning which passes between us and constitutes a we? Rather than claiming that we are staging a politics which has direct resonance in the world and a direct corollary in the regimes of policies and directives, I would want to say that we are staging the possibility of a politics without a plan. And that this politics without a plan, the ability for us to stage ourselves and perform ourselves as taking part in a politics that we cannot then translate immediately into something that is applicable, is participation. And is the participation that I think we have a whole set of possibilities to stimulate, to host, not necessarily to generate in